Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I am honored to have Dr. Brian Mcveigh back. And today's topic is particularly fascinating to me, self-narratization. So, Brian is writing a book on application of Julian Jaynes to personal growth and psychotherapy. So this is part of that book. Can't wait till the book comes out, but we get the previews. So Brian, take it away.
Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. What I'm going to do now is share this, just make sure it pops up. Okay, everyone can see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, good. So as you can see, the title of today's discussion, Self-Narratization, Mapping a Personal Timeline to Better Plan One's Goals. So if you look at this list of what I call features of conscious interiority, you'll notice that the past several sessions I've talked about mental space, introception, or what we might call mental imagery, and excerption. And today, as I said, we'll be talking about self-narratization. So the reason why I'm pointing this out to you is because I want us to see how these different features of conscious interiority are very much interrelated or even built upon each other. And for those of you, if this is the first time you have attended one of these discussions, and if it's not clear to you exactly what I mean by conscious interiority and what I mean by what I call a Jaynesian psychotherapeutics, of course, we can talk about that later. But in any case, hopefully you'll get up to speed as I start to talk about these different aspects of consciousness. So basically, I'm talking about three things today. One is a Jaynesian psychotherapeutics. Two, the nature of conscious interiority. And three, self-narratization. Okay, so let's so as I said a moment ago, this idea of mental space or mental spatialization is important for understanding today's focus, which is self-narratization. So when we talk about mental spatialization, what we mean is the belief that within our heads there's a place that allows us to imagine, to spread out time as a succession of events upon which we can see ourselves moving towards the past or the future. It also allows us to evoke things that have not yet occurred. Of course, that would be the future. So the point here is you cannot really self-narratize yourself on a timeline unless you have an imaginary place to do that. And that may seem commonsensical, but it's very important because, as I said, these different features of conscious interiority don't really make sense unless we appreciate how they are interlocked and interrelated with each other. So when we linearize a personal timeline, and that's just another way to talk about self-narratization, as I've said, this involves a number of other features of conscious interiority. I've already mentioned mental spatialization. Another feature, and one that I talked about, I believe several weeks ago, is excerption. And so what does excerption mean? Well, so when we are, you might say, dwelling in our mental space, in a sense, we are detached from the limitations, restrictions of the real physical world. And we are able to edit or select out mental sceneries, and that is what excerption means. And it also related to this idea of excerption is provides the eye. In other words, well, we might say the mind's eye, the eye, the mind's eye, not necessarily the same thing, but they are related. But in any case, it provides us with a vast scenery, a panorama of previous and current events. And so the metaphor I'm using here in this shot, of course, is editing a movie, right? So we might view certain features of conscious interiority as giving us the ability to edit mental sceneries. So excerption also provides us with a hypothetical imaginary world, a world filled with could be's, maybes, should be's, as well as future possibilities. And just let me stop here and point out that, again, this may seem commonsensical, but it doesn't really make sense unless we look at history. And the question we should be asking ourselves, and it's a question that Julian Jaynes asked, is to what degree were people, say 4,000 years ago, able to excerpt? To what degree were they able to imagine the hypothetical? And of course, most of the time, most people assume, well, Homo sapiens has always been able to do that. But if you look at the historical record very clearly, what you'll see is that's not necessarily true. Or I think a better way to put it, people who, according to Jaynes, were pre-conscious were not able to do it to the degree that we are. In other words, they were not able to self-narratize. They were not able to excerpt mental sceneries with such power. This is something that societies, according to Jaynes, had to learn. It was an upgrading of human mental capabilities. And again, I just want to emphasize, unless you look carefully at the ancient historical record, that may not be, the point I'm making may not be obvious. So I'm not saying that pre-conscious people could not imagine something to some degree. Obviously, they could plan. If they had complicated irrigation systems, they had calendrics, they were able to build pyramids and great temples. But nevertheless, compared to the modern ability that we possess to imagine a future, that did not exist. So it's a matter of degree, and I think that's important to emphasize. And I've said this many times before: the whole idea of the future, that society's future can be so different, is a pretty recent invention. It's only maybe 200 or 300 years old. Actually, I'd say maybe 150, 200 years old. Again, we take the idea of the future for granted, but the idea that the future can be engineered, that we can engineer society to be a better place, is a very recent invention. Again, that doesn't make much sense unless you look at the historical record. So I think I've already mentioned this. We take self-narratization for granted. And I think that's why some people struggle with trying to grasp what Jaynes meant by conscious interiority. It's sort of like time and space. We dwell within these dimensions. So we usually don't question them. We usually don't examine them very carefully. But one way to appreciate what self-narratization means is to note that apparently when many people are hypnotized, their experience of time changes. So a beforeness and an afterness of spatialized time is missing. And the reason for that, of course, according to Janes, is because when you're hypnotized, most of the features of conscious interiority are suspended or eroded. And this is the role that hypnosis plays in Janesian psychology is a topic for another day, another discussion. But in any case, I just wanted to point that out. So to quote James, we used spatialized succession of conscious time as a substrate for successions of memories. So in other words, memories are built upon our personal timelines. So when I say personal timeline, a personal timeline could be your entire life, if you're able to remember, if your memory is very good. A personal timeline could be the past several years. It could be the past several hours. Okay. So in any case, the point here is, and I've said this before in other discussions, I think to understand the nature of psyche, to understand the nature of human psychology, time is essential. Temporality is vital for understanding how the human psyche works. So whether we're talking about the evolution of Homo sapiens, or we're talking about drastic cultural changes that occurred 3,000 years ago that, according to Janes, led to the invention of conscious interiority, or we're talking about the psychological development of an individual, or we're talking about something that has happened to an individual the past few years, the past few months, however you look at it, you cannot understand the human psychology unless you view it as something that is always changing, always adapting. And that's why I stress this a temporal view of human psychology. So in a way, what I'm talking about today, it's not terribly new or revolutionary. Many people have pointed out how it is a fundamental human need to make sense of events, rather from an individual perspective or from the perspective of a society or a community. This whole idea of storytelling is so important. Of course, what happens sometimes is we get derailed from perceiving matters clearly, or we put up defenses to avoid dealing with painful thoughts. And so now I'm sort of shifting gears and I'm looking at things from a more psychotherapeutic point of view. And how does this relate to self-narratization? We'll get to that in a moment. But in any case, just to reiterate this point here, when we talk about self-narratization, we're basically talking about, in a more prosaic manner, storytelling. And storytelling is about giving meaning to the events of the individual's life. But just let me digress a little bit here. What happens sometimes, though, and we can talk about this later, is that it's not so simple that an individual is shaping their own narrative, right? Nobody does that. We are born into certain historical periods. We are born into certain cultural places, and we are given scripts. We are given a sort of a schema to follow. And so, of course, we'd like to think that we have some self-autonomy, that we have some say in the story we are writing about ourselves, or the self-narratization that we are following. But to a large degree, other people, or we might say society in general, is shaping the stories that we tell ourselves. That's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. However, of course, we can talk about this later. There are many instances when it is not a good thing. So in any case, I just wanted to make that point. So again, in a psychotherapeutic setting, insight occurs when we step back and are able to see things from a new perspective, to have an understanding of why we interpret things the way we do as they unfold through time. So when you stop and think about it, this idea of insight, of course, is a real staple of counseling and psychotherapy. And to gain a new perspective, to reframe our experiences, to look at things from a different angle. It doesn't sound very revolutionary, I suppose, but the point I'm making is that if we do this more explicitly, if we view the search for a new perspective as something that unfolds through time, that follows a personal trajectory, then of course things become more clear, because there may have been things that happened in the past that are influencing us that we're not aware of, or there may be things that we're afraid of that might occur in the future that are shaping or misshaping our view of the world. So this idea, again, insight, one way to gain insight, it's not just a matter of gaining a new perspective, but it's looking at things, as I said before, from a temporal perspective. Where did I come from? Where am I now? And where am I going? So, of course, the past can be problematic for those who have been abused. They perhaps have a very painful personal timeline, a very traumatic self-narratization that they have a hard time sharing with other people. You could argue that they have a hard time sharing it with themselves. So in any case, these quotes are just things that I jotted down from some clients that I thought were sort of nifty. The past is something to reflect on, not live in. Don't look in the rearview mirror, because objects may appear larger than they are. The past is history. The future is a mystery. The present is a gift. The past, that's what built me. Now I want to take the house down and rebuild it. So again, you can see these interesting metaphors being used to understand a person's life from a temporal perspective. So now I'm going to be a little more specific on the therapeutic implications of self-narratization. Some of you, I'm sure, are aware. So there is a therapy built around self-narratization called self-therapy. It actually grew out of family therapy. But the idea here is it views people as constructing their own worldviews. And so if that's the case, if the individual, in a sense, even though, to go back to that caveat I had about how cultures and societies and historical forces do shape our scripts, nevertheless, we can make the argument that there's a fair amount of self-autonomy involved in how a person tells stories to themselves, how they create their own timeline. And if that's the case, the idea here is, if we're suffering, if we're in pain, if we're being held back by something that happened to us, we're not seeing the world as clearly as we should, this is impacting in a negative way our interpersonal relationships, then we have to figure out a way to rewrite our stories, to look at things from a different angle. So narrative therapy is about showing people the meanings that they attach to their stories, to their life stories, and how they play an active role in self-conception, self-definition. And that, of course, hopefully can allow people to reauthor their personal narratives. So this is just more discussion of what narrative therapy is all about. So it helps individuals recognize what forces have influenced their narrative. So, for example, perhaps dynamics within a family. For some people who come in into a clinical setting, their stories may be filled with all types of regret, guilt, shame, self-blame. in order to guide a patient to a point from which they can see how certain self-conceptions or self-interpretations of their narratives are not helping them. They're being maladaptive. Of course, there are a large number of therapeutic techniques that can be used. Some of these techniques, I won't go into today, I'll mention a couple, but some of these techniques are specific to narrative therapy. Other techniques, of course, are techniques that are used by used in various systems of psychotherapy. Well, here's an example: deconstruction, to externalize the problem. So if a patient comes in, the idea is to teach him or her how to view issues as outside oneself rather than being an essential part of one's identity. And this helps them avoid, this affords them, this gives them alternative choices and allows a menu of different stories. So we're talking about rewriting one's self-narratization, rewriting one's story by having the person realize that whatever that incident, that happening, that event on their personal timeline, whatever that was, it does not define them. It's something that happened to them. It's a part of them. But whatever that thing is, or it could be a very strong negative emotion, it has to be deconstructed, or we might say diffused. It must be separated from one's identity. And then that frees one up to reauthor a new self-narratization, a more adaptive self-narratization. Reconstruction, reauthoring. So the idea is, once we identify certain things that happened on a timeline that may be holding a person back, then individuals are encouraged to drop certain stories, what we might call self-limiting stories, so that they can increase awareness and control over their misconceptions. And so they may be encouraged to explore new options for problem solving. And that way, a more optimistic self-interpretation can be written. So, for example, this can be done by having an individual separate themselves from self-identities that simply are not helping them, that may have been assigned by others, not necessarily in a traumatic way, but perhaps just the way they were brought up. Sometimes it's very subtle. And now in a lot of clinical work, clinicians are being encouraged to wrap up treatment quickly by insurance companies. So the idea is to only have maybe 6 or 8 sessions, and the idea is to take care of a particular problem within 6 or 8 weeks, maybe 10 weeks. And that does happen, that can happen. But one thing I've noticed with certain individuals is that it can take months for them to figure out what their self-narratization is all about, why something is holding them back. It does not necessarily happen in what is called brief therapy. It can take quite a while sometimes. But in any case, I give an example. Sometimes people are taught to be a victim. Well, of course, if you consider yourself a victim, you're going to be looking at things from a certain lens. And so the idea is to figure out how to rewrite that script you were given, maybe throw that script out that taught you to be a victim. So in any case, this is what reconstructing or reauthoring one's self-narratization is all about. So self-narratization makes us capable of visualizing and hypothesizing the place we have not traveled to yet, allowing us to introceive new paths and plans. And again, it is very important to bring in these other features of conscious interiority, because we're talking about a package and they're all related. So the idea here, if we can help someone with their self-narratization, this is going to increase, it's going to enhance things like self-autonomy, self-authorization. So I've been talking about looking at self-narratization from a clinical perspective, but as I always say, it's important to keep in mind that all this information works, or you might say has application outside of a clinical setting. This is something that we can, I think, all take something from, to look at our lives and question ourselves. Where did we come from? Are there perhaps things in my personal timeline that are bothering me, not necessarily in a way that I'm aware of? There may be unconscious or subconscious issues that are distorting or somehow making my self-narratization maladaptive. So that's the end of the PowerPoint. Just let me get out of there. Okay.
All right. So what I want to do, folks, and Brian, is that I want people, instead of just having questions one by one and answering them, I want to have the best questions raised and answers. And the simplest way we found of doing that is to do breakout rooms. So we'll go to the breakout rooms for only about 15 to 20 minutes. Folks, in the breakout rooms, let everybody speak for 1 to 2 minutes on what themes that they see, what questions that they have. And then when you come back, each person, anybody who wants, can put a question on the table. And we will collect all the questions. And once we have collected all the questions, we'll organize them, and then Brian will answer all of them. Okay, so you get to ask all the questions, but you get to discuss, and brainstorm with others about the questions that you have first. So you can put your best questions together. I strongly recommend using pen and paper to keep track of all the things that you have, all the magnificent things that you can think of, and then come back and we will have a Q&A. We will do the breakout rooms for only about 15 minutes just to get your brainstorm going, and then we will do the Q&A, starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. Welcome back, everybody. Great. So now it's time for questions. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom if you'd like to put a question on the table. Only questions. We are not doing any statements. We are just doing questions at this point. Regine, what's your question? Give me just a second. I think I need to set something up here. Hold on. All right, go ahead, Regine.
Okay. From early on, it really stuck with me to think of a core self and me's going out, interacting with the world. And I'm thinking it would be useful for me and easier to do a narrative for each of those me's. Each of the different selves that interact with the world.
Okay, excellent.
And I'm wondering if he has advice about whether or how to combine those.
Wonderful.
A narrative of the self.
Wonderful. Excellent, excellent question. How do you handle narratives of multiple selves? Excellent. Next up is going to be Carl, Cheryl, and David, followed by Shaggy. Carl.
Yes, I was curious about whether it struck me that there's a parallel between the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we consume through mass media. So the most powerful arts, movies, TV, literature, fiction. Was wondering if Julian Jaynes kind of talked about that as kind of like, that it affects our lives as kind of like a metaphor, because we become the characters and we get to see other people's lives and how they relate to relationships in those stories.
Wonderful. So I'll put it as how do the stories we consume affect or shape the stories we tell ourselves?
Yeah.
Thank you. Next up is Cheryl, followed by David. Cheryl.
Well, I've been thinking lately, I'm 68, I'm retired academic living alone. And I find that my question would be, well, let me frame it a little bit. So a lot of the narratives I've told myself over the years of different things that have happened to me have changed as I've aged, and I've learned more and had more experiences. And suddenly I look at that story and I have a completely different interpretation of it. And for the most part, that's good. But I also feel like sometimes, especially during the pandemic, I get too caught up in re-narratizing. And that was the issue I raised. Is it possible to do it too much?
Wonderful, wonderful. So what is the role of re-narratizing? And is there, can you do it too much? Very good. Re-narratizing. Okay, next up is going to be David, Shaggy, Alvaro, and Alvaro. David.
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. I mean, part of what we were discussing was about that human beings want to create a hero's journey for themselves, a hero's story. And I've seen in some other conversations that the hero's journey can be negative. I mean, that you can create a hero's journey where you are the best at being something horrible. You can be the best victim. You can be the best codependent. You can be the best. And so, how does that really? I'm interested in Brian's comments about how to create this positive narrative, or what are the challenges with these traumas or these psychological issues that Brian was mentioning, and how to ensure that we formulate it positively, or his thoughts about this negative hero journey.
Wonderful. How do you create a positive hero's journey and avoid the stories of a negative hero's journey? Excellent. Next up is going to be Shaggy. Go ahead. Shaggy, would you like to speak out your question, or I'll read it for you if you want? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you for giving me the time. I just wanted to ask, is self-narrative helpful in long run?
Wonderful. Self-narrative in long run. Okay, what role self-narrative plays in long run in people's lives? Very good.
Yes.
Next up is going to be Alvaro.
Yes, I wanted to ask, and Brian was already addressing this question before we came back. I wanted to ask how to go about self-narratizing traumatic events. How do we see a silver lining in them, especially events in which the whole community may be giving you different narrative, like if you're being bullied at school, for example, and other events such as maybe a rape, in which it's very difficult to see a positive coming from that.
Wonderful. Excellent question. How do you self-narratize traumatic events, especially when there is a group narrative involved? Excellent. All right, so we got 6 questions. So we're going to go ahead and just go through them one by one at this point. Let me see if there is any structure here, stories here. Give me just a second, okay? Multiple selves, re-narratization, how do you create positive? Okay, so let's start with Shaggy's question. And folks, if you have questions, you can keep on putting exclamation marks. We will have time for more questions. I think we're doing really well on time here. Okay, so I'm organizing them in kind of general to particular sequence. So I'm going to start with Shaggy's question. So Brian, Shaggy asked, what role does self-narratization play in our lives in long run?
So that is that's a big question. And I guess what I would say is, as I mentioned before, when we self-narratize, we could narratize the past several hours, the past day, past few years. There's usually a motivation, a reason why we carve out a particular timeline, but there's certainly no reason why we can't narratize, as you said, long term. I think perhaps what you're getting at is to narratize our entire lives, and people do that. And then it gets a little bit complicated because how do we fit in the shorter narratives into this longer narratives? And at least in the clinical setting, the idea is to identify what a particular what is bothering an individual, why are they coming in the first place, and then to take that issue and to look at it to see what role that issue played in shaping one's personal timeline. And so, this idea of a long-term self-narratization, this really, it's not just of course, it's more than a clinical issue. This really is almost, the way I view it, almost more of a existentialist, a spiritual issue. And so, the only other thing I would say in response to this is it comes down to the individual. And if you notice on the list of features of conscious interiority, one of the key features is what is called self-individuation. And that's a very personal, that's how do I, as an individual, distinguish myself from other people? What is different about me? What is unique about me? And so if someone came in and they were interested in looking at their life from a long-term perspective, that's the place I would start. What is different about your individual personal timeline?
Wonderful. Next, let's
Thank
go
you, Brian.
to, thank you, Shaggy, a great question. Next, let's go to Cheryl's question. Cheryl had very interesting things. She said, firstly, that, stories you tell yourself changes over time. If you've lived long enough, you can look back upon stories you told yourself 20 years ago and evaluate them. And the way you think about them is different. So one part, if you could comment on how this self-narratization changes over the years, over the decades. That's one part. And second part is that, is there something like you're trying to re-narratize? Says it's important to, clearly it's important to re-narratize, but is there some such thing as re-narratizing too much?
So yes, of course, to address the first question, as we get older, we will have new experiences, meet different people, and this is that, although all that information, all that knowledge has to be somehow integrated into our ever evolving, our ever changing self-narratization. Again, to go back to what I said about the importance of time, about viewing the human psyche as something temporal. It at least while we're alive, that timeline is continuously being added to. And then sometimes we stop and we look at it, and I know my own experience, I surprise myself sometimes when I say, did I do that? Did I write that? It's almost as if a different person did it. So that's I think an important point. Then as far as the second question, yes, I talked about this a bit in the breakout, and I'm glad that this was brought up because I didn't talk about it in my discussion, but I think it's a key issue. So self-narratization, the way I discussed it was from pretty much a positive perspective. that there's something inherently good about knowing one's personal timeline and knowing how to rewrite it, being courageous enough to rewrite it. However, as a feature of conscious interiority, sometimes there is too much self-narratization, and that's true for all the features, and I think especially for self-narratization. And what happens is, not necessarily just in a clinical setting, but somebody becomes obsessed with something that happened to them in the past. They keep ruminating on it, and it just escalates negative emotions. Or the other thing people have a tendency to do, of course, is to look forward to the future and worry too much about what's going to happen. So there is most definitely a dark side, a negative aspect to self-narratization or self-re-narratization. So that's actually an important point. I mean, that's what a lot of psychotherapy is about, really, is about dealing with someone who has not been able to integrate negative past experiences.
Wonderful. Just on this, just a quick follow-up. I mean, the way I see kind of self-narratization, it's like a control mechanism to guide your actual life. So the control mechanism has to be in some proportion with the life itself. If you're in a loop trying to kind of rework your stories and forget to live, then that is self-defeating.
Right. I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay. Thank you. Next up is David's question about creating positive hero's journey. There are many people who have stories where they are the victims and they continue to use those stories, and that kind of shapes their lives. So how do you evaluate whether the stories you're telling yourself are positive or negative? And then how do you move to a more positive? If you notice that, okay, I'm treating myself as a victim in all my stories, how do you fix that?
Well, I think the most simple place to start would be to have someone sit down and actually write down what they think, why they think they're a victim, to describe an experience, to break that experience down into thoughts about the experience, and to also break it down into emotions they have about that experience, about being a victim. And then encourage the person to write down times when they were not a victim, and to really think hard about that. And again, to identify the thoughts and to identify the emotions, and then have them compare these two lists, if you will, being a victim and not being a victim. And that may have to be done multiple times. But if a person is really working on trying to be self-objective, what they will see probably is that, yes, there were times when they were victims. Many of us are victims of something, but there are other times when, in fact, they were not a victim. And once they start to identify those times when they were not a victim, then the next step is to talk about what were they doing to make sure that they were not a victim? What was different about them? And to really cultivate those positive experiences associated with not being a victim.
Okay, let's take Alvaro's question, which naturally follows from it. How do you self-narratize when you have had a traumatic experience, especially when there is a group narrative involved? It's a group experience. How do you self-narratize?
Yeah, so that's an important question too, and that's it's a little bit complicated because it's actually two questions, but I'll attempt to address at least the first part. So the idea is that when someone has a trauma, and I discussed this a little bit in the breakout, what happens is the mind, the individual will start to present with symptoms, nightmares, flashbacks, mood disorders, physiological reactions, panic attacks. And what's going on there is that the mind has not integrated all those negative experiences from the trauma. And those symptoms are the mind's way of dealing, of trying to, we might say, to use a metaphor, to digest those terrible experiences. So what should happen, at least in a clinical setting, if it's a real trauma, if someone is diagnosed with PTSD, what should happen is, first, you want to build a therapeutic relationship, a therapeutic alliance with the individual. Let them know that they are in a safe place, that anytime they come to see the therapist or whoever, that they are not going to be judged, and that they are not going, because many people, as strange as it sounds, may have guilt about being traumatized, right? But the idea is, once you make them feel safe, in fact, to be more specific, you might even engage in some what we call somatic psychotherapy, some deep breathing, relaxation, and then gradually have that person narratize what happened to them. And that's a little bit tricky, because everyone is different. And some people want to jump right in, and they feel comfortable describing what happened to them, describing the traumatic event. Other people need more time. It can take weeks or months. But the idea, and I often recommend that people write it down. It makes it more real when they write it down. As long as they're comfortable with beginning to write things down and to describe the event, that allows the mind to begin to reintegrate those negative experiences. You don't want to move too fast, because you don't want to re-traumatize the person, of course. So each individual is different. But this is how narratization is actually used for healing purposes, because it's allowing the mind to confront something that it's afraid of.
Oh, thank you. That was a great answer. Very, very useful. Next, let's go to Carl's question about what is the relationship between the stories that we consume, that we are bombarded with in our culture through media. And this is not just a modern phenomenon. This has gone on for forever. What is the relationship between the stories of the culture and what you're immersed in, and your own story? How does your own story, is it completely separate? How does it influence? How do they influence your story?
Yes, so I think most definitely art plays a role in shaping a community's style, or we might even say the topics of self-narratization. So especially when we're young, we're very impressionable. We're all influenced, for example, by maybe superheroes. And so art actually can allow a person, it provides a person not just with models of how to self-narratize, but it can give them inspiration. And I think it's important to point out that there's been a lot of historical change. So centuries ago, art, there was not as much art as there is today. And so the models, we might say, that people consumed were limited in number. But now, in postmodern times, it's much more complicated. It seems that everyone is given so many choices, a real menu to be inspired for self-narratization. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think, of course, is debatable. But and I think this goes back to this idea of how we change as we age. So if I see a movie when I'm 12 or 13 years old, it may somehow relate to my own personal experiences. But when I see that movie a decade or even 2 or 3 decades later, it's the same exact movie, but my self-narratization, how I relate to that movie, can be completely different. So in any case, again, it's sort of a difficult question to answer, because I think it's very obvious that most definitely what we consume from the art world does shape our self-narratizations. It doesn't determine our self-narratizations, but it certainly does. It does play a role.
Does the same thing happen with people around us? These stories, the self-narratization of our parents, of our community. So it's like at a personal level, does the same thing happen?
Yes, that's a good point to bring up. So we will model our self-narratizations often, or somehow our self-narratizations will be very much influenced by parental figures, by authority figures, by someone that we're close to. It's not a matter that they just play a role in our self-narratization. How they actually self-narratize, how they view events, how they viewed a long-term experience, they'll internalize, and then somehow we will absorb those self-narratizing trajectories.
Yeah, I remember at a very small scale level, I remember these videos of children hearing an alarming sound, and depending on how the reaction of the parent is, they just look at the parent to say, what does this mean?
Yes.
And the parent actually, their reaction is what they go with.
That's right. Yes, it's quite amazing.
Yeah. Okay. We have one more question in this list, and then I'm going to open it up for more questions. So keep your questions coming. Regine asks about like multiple selves. Like, you have multiple selves in many different ways. You have like your personas at work, you have your personas at home, so you have kind of these multiple stories, not necessarily a single story. So if you have multiple stories, how do these multiple self-narratizations work? Is there any integration to them? Are they all separate? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, interesting way to look at it. Yes, I think that it can work both ways. I think that, well, let's start with the premise that most definitely we have multiple personal timelines, depending on what roles we're playing, depending on what experience we want to recount. So if we think about it very carefully, a person is really composed of multiple timelines, multiple self-narratizations. And some of those self-narratizations are going to borrow information from each other. Some will be integrated, but others will not be integrated for a variety of reasons. And certainly in a clinical setting, the idea, if someone presents with a certain problem, the idea is usually to alert the person to the fact that they have actually many personal timelines, many trajectories that they can follow, because the idea is to increase their self-autonomy, to increase their self-individuation, because sometimes what happens, I think, is we get stuck on just one self-narratization. For example, playing the victim is an easy one to point to, but the idea here is to give them freedom, to show them that they do in fact have some freedom of choice, and that they probably have more positive self-narratizations, more positive personal timelines than they think, because when we're in a bad mood, it restricts our thinking, it restricts our range of attention.
Wonderful. So folks, now I'm going to open it up for more questions. So it's going to be David and Stefan next. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you have questions. David.
Yes, thanks, Srikanth. Thanks, Brian, for the excellent insights and your answers so far. So I wanted to follow up about the self-narratization as it relates to the real self. I mean, I've seen in some other places I've studied about people essentially hiding off their real self. I mean, in a cave, in a wall, and they're presenting this false self, this fake self. And so I was curious, and that might be what people think is the rational part of themselves, but it really isn't driving their lives. It really is this hidden real self that's the subconscious that's driving it. So I was wondering if narratization is in the reality a way of trying to inject or get information to this real self and change this subconscious idea, change this shadow self to teach them a new story, and somehow inject that past the rational mind to change the drivers of the person because no matter what you think you're going to do rationally, I mean, the subconscious drives are always changing your attention, changing your actual abilities. So I was wondering if that's part of what narratization actually accomplishes.
Yes, it most certainly can. And I think what we're talking about here is many times there's a lot of non-conscious material about a person, or there have been certain experiences that a person has had that they have forgotten or suppressed or repressed for whatever reason, or we just forget. I mean, our lives are much more varied and complicated than we assume them to be. It's very easy to forget that, as I was just talking about, how we do have multiple timelines. And so the idea here is to, I think, to teach someone how to be as objective as possible. And there are different ways to do that. Sometimes something as simple as having someone bring in a lot of pictures of their lives, pictures that I'm from an older generation. Now people take multiple pictures of everything, so it's not a big deal. But when I was young, a photograph meant something. Your family did not have a lot of photographs necessarily, but in any case, the idea here is to bring in objects, not just a photograph, but something that triggers a memory, and to have the person build multiple timelines by looking at their own past. And again, that way it hopefully alerts them to more positive experiences that they had. It may, of course, it'll also alert them to negative things that have happened. And that's good, that's fine, because the idea here, when we talk about, as you mentioned, looking for the authentic self, it's not, when we say authentic self, it's not always a very positive thing. To my mind, excuse me, an authentic self is authentic because it's looking at both the positive and the negative sides of what it means to be a person. And so the idea is to be, as much as possible, self-objective and bring in all these different aspects of a person's selfhood.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Stefan, Mike, and Cheryl. Stefan.
Okay, I'm just going to read my question that I typed in here. So how do you know when to balance between confronting old and potentially self-destructive self-narratizations and creating new self-narratizations? And actually, I have a second question. I guess maybe we could try to answer them both at the same time. To what extent can you change your self-narratizations, such as the ones that have been in your mind for decades?
So I'll answer the first one first. Your first question about changing self-narratizations. Yeah, I think they can be changed. And I think there are many ways to do that. It may take some time, depending on what's going on with a particular individual. But yes, self-narratizations can be changed. And when I say change, it's not necessarily about getting rid of a certain self-narratization. It's not about getting rid of a negative self-narratization. It's taking some self-narratization and looking at it more objectively, because we, as I said before, we want to make sure that we are integrating both the negative and positive aspects of a person's life. And the first question, could you just quickly repeat what the first question was?
Yeah, sure. I'm just wondering, like, essentially, like, how do you know when to balance between, like looking at like your more shadow self and those self-narratizations that could be potentially debilitating throughout your daily life and you might not even realize it, like balancing between that and creating new ones, because I would think that you can't just push out the old ones by just creating a bunch of new ones. Like the old ones kind of need some attention, but how would you know when to balance between these two?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I have to say it's difficult to answer. I mean, I think, but I think your larger point is a good point. It's well taken, that we have to balance what you refer to as the shadow self, and then maybe a newer, more positive self. But I guess the way I would look at it is, if someone is working or trying to explore their shadow self, and it brings up a lot of negative effect, it's really escalating their emotions, and it's triggering all types of things, um, to the point where it's interfering with that person's activities of daily life, or it's interfering with trying to build a new, different, more positive self. Then I think I would draw a line. I mean, there's something to be said for, well, we have to get to the bottom. We have to investigate why a shadow self or negative part of our selfhood is causing these problems. But if a person is functioning well ordinarily, except for the time when they start to investigate and explore their shadow self, then I would say give it a rest. I would say give it a rest for now. And then maybe later on, 2 or 3 weeks later, if a person wants to talk about the shadow self, or however you want to put it, then that it might be revisited. But yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say, I don't know if there's any one particular way to answer that. I think it comes down to the individual, and I think what's important is to find out where is the individual at, what is their motivation, why do they want to explore shadow self, if it's some negative aspect of themselves that they want to explore. So I really think it depends on the particular situation, depends on the particular individual. But in any case, like I said, I don't really have a clear cut answer for that, but it's something that certainly should be thought about.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by Cheryl. Mike.
Hi, I'm trying to reconcile what self-narratization is about, with the concept of the great man in history. Like somebody once invented a wheel, and pretty soon everybody was using it, with some degree of evolvement, which is still going on. And I view this self-narratization and the idea of consciousness and religion and language and speech was probably developed by some person, either intellectually or serendipitously, and suddenly it became a mechanism for explaining a bunch of things. And the goodness of self-narratization and its flaws are likely to be supplanted by some other magic that makes it all better. Can you say some words about that? Oh, one more thing. We talked about the Aborigines in one of the sessions. You take an Aborigine person and you put them into our system, and he might be twice as good or not as one of us. And it can happen in one generation. Well, can you expand on that and maybe reconcile my disbeliefs in it?
So, Mike, yeah, I'm trying to formulate a response to what you said about the great man of history and self-narratization. So one thing that comes to mind is that we cannot assume that all individuals have a clear sense of self-narratization. And I think some people, this idea of a great man of history, or somebody who feels or does impact history in a major way, probably is going to have a very robust, clear sense of self-narratization, where they came from, where they are, and where they're going. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or clarifies anything for you, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is a difference in the ability of various individuals to self-narratize. Some people do it more than others. And I think in certain cultures, perhaps some people may be encouraged to do it more than others. It really depends. And to get just one final comment to get back what you said about Aborigines. So I think that in certain societies that, for lack of a better term, are pre-literate or not technologically advanced, pre-industrial societies, in societies like that, of course, the individual will be able to narratize to some degree as a self, but a lot of their narratization will be happening from the perspective of being a member of a community. And for someone who was raised in a post-industrial, postmodern society, they're going to have a very different view of what it means to narratize. So I think that's an important point. And this shows us how powerful culture is in shaping a feature of conscious interiority, such as self-narratization.
Excellent point. I mean, this is kind of the heart of Julian Jaynes' point about, moving from just taking all the stories and listening to the stories of the ancestors and the kings and the gods and following them, versus being able to create and project your own stories in your mental space. Next up is Cheryl, followed by David. Cheryl.
Brian, you've used the example several times, and it's an easy example for, I would suspect, for many of us to relate to, the victim narrative, the way we narratize ourselves as victims. And that made me think about some of my younger friends that I talk to, when they narratize themselves in their families, in their workplaces, and the way we project a kind of narratization on the people around us about their motives or whatever. And I'm trying to get to this in your practice, because we often perceive the others. I was thinking that there's this triad, the victim, the persecutor, the rescuer.
Mhm.
And so a lot of us have an easy time narratizing ourselves as victims or rescuers. But do you have people who actually narratize themselves as oppressors, as persecutors?
That's a fascinating question. I would say yes. I would say yes. I think that there are people who get some sort of misguided kick out of persecuting other people, unfortunately. So that would be my short answer. Yes. So self-narratization is not necessarily a positive thing within this context. I mean, people will go out of their way. They'll get some sort of, as I said, satisfaction out of victimizing other people. So yeah, it's sort of a cynical, dark view of human nature, perhaps. But unfortunately, I feel I've met many people that are like that.
How do you deal with them?
How do I deal with them? I don't. Well, I mean, in my personal life, I try to avoid them If they come to me as a patient, of course, that's a bit difficult. Though I will say that many times people who are like that, when they come to see me, they treat me, I'm not saying this is always the case, but they seem to treat me neutrally, where they don't treat their family members nicely. Many times it surprises me, they seem to be on their good behavior with me for some reason. But then I hear about what they have done to their families, or I hear from their family members what's going on, and it's almost like it's a different person. So when they come to see me, it's almost like they're in a separate space with me, where like I said, for some reason, I'm not a target usually. I'd like to think the reason why is because they know they need some sort of help, and they're there to get help. I mean, sometimes I'll be a target, but in any case, that's just my own personal experience.
Thank you. Last question is from David. David.
Okay, thanks, Shrikant. And I mean, just very briefly follow up. I mean, and related to my earlier question and what Cheryl said, and thanks for the great insights again from Brian. And I completely agree, because what I've heard from other experts such as Sam Vaknin is that there are like psychopaths will consider themselves in the hero's journey of being the best psychopath in the world. I mean, that's their goal, is to consider themselves a hero as a psychopath. Or people who are, codependent or whatever, yes, I'm the victim, but I've survived all of this trauma, all of these horrible things. And so they're very proud, or they create a story where they're proud of being the victim in that sense. They're proud of having survived that, as opposed to having, and overcoming of continuing to accept all of that oppression. But my question really for Brian was, again, the really interesting exchange with Mike is about these pre-industrial societies, pre-industrial cultures. And because we've had, stories and mythologies for eons, and what is the historical anthropological understanding of this self-narratization, in the sense that, as you're saying, there was this transition from maybe a group, a cultural type of, a tribal narratization to a personalized narratization, because people, as the other comments, are very interested in movies and these fictional characters, and our brains seem to be designed to be able to engage with stories, movies we see, or wrestling matches, hockey, whatever. We want that sort of a story to be engaged with, and that we sympathetically view ourselves in terms of that. So how does that ability to engage with, let's say you are a fan of a hockey player or a football player, or somebody as that narratization, with and the history of these mythological characters, and personally connecting with that to the modern narratization of the individual? What's the research on that?
Thank you for that question. I don't know if I can answer it from the perspective of research that's been done on that, but I'll give you my general impression. So even though the ability to narratize has increased during the past several thousand years, if you look at things from a Jaynesian perspective, especially when you get up into modern times, where people talk about individualism. It's supposed to be a very American way of looking at the world, but the way I look at things globally is modernization is making everyone around the world very individualistic, because it's giving us the resources to stand alone, to stand away from our families, to stand away from communities. So I think at the global level, this individualizing, or you might call it self-individuation, another feature of conscious interiority, relates to this whole idea of building our own narratives, and that is increasing. But at the same time, there are things that don't that are, I guess you might say, are universal, that when I think about it have really struck me. This idea of how hero worship has not gone away, and how people, even though we, for example, to take American society, we pride ourselves on being very individualistic. But the truth of the matter is, we depend an awful lot on, for lack of a better term, heroes, whether they're anti-heroes, whether these are people who help society or do not help society, make things worse. There is an innate instinct, I think, that humans have for looking for a savior, for it's almost as if when we were infants and we had to rely on our parental figures to help us get through, that never goes away. And there's always this child in us that is looking for a leader. And that can be a good thing if the leader is taking us in the right direction, but it can also be a very bad thing if they're taking us in the wrong direction. And I'm not sure if that answers directly your question, but as I said, I think there are some things that have maybe some aspects of the human condition that have been updated over the centuries, but some things haven't really changed that much. And I think especially now, we're living in this sort of a strange time where all around the world, we see many political systems that are headed by strong men, by people, individuals who tap into a type of populism, this idea that only I have the answers and only I can lead the political system in the direction it should go. I just find it both disturbing and fascinating. What's been going on. I don't have any explanations. What has been going on the past 5 to 10 years, where in all societies, whether in North America, in Europe, South America, parts of Asia, we see a sort of recurrence actually of the 1930s, this strange human drive to look for easy answers in a leader. This relates actually to what James called authorization. I won't go into it now, it's a whole other topic, but there is a feature of conscious interiority called self-authorization. So who do I authorize? When I act, who do I get my permission from? Do I get it from a god, an ancestor, a tribal ruler, a king, a pharaoh, or do I get it from myself? So that's a topic for another day, this idea of self-authorization.
Wonderful. Brian, that was fantastic. I think we managed to cover a lot in a short time. And what we're going to do is that we are continuing this as a series. So some of these themes are going to keep coming back in one form or the other. So thank you very much, Brian. And thanks, everybody. Great questions.
Thank you. Good questions. Bye, everyone.
Bye. See ya.